Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. I wish you could have seen me just now. I just sneezed and I about blasted my eardrums out with, I've got my, microphone here set up and my headphones on, and I have had the absolute worst allergies lately. So, I'm glad you guys didn't hear that, but oh my gosh, the struggle is real. But anyways, we're not here to talk about allergies today. We're here to talk about The Clue of the Whistling Bagpipes, one of my favorite Nancy Drew books. Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't actually remember key points to this plot, but I knew that it was set in Scotland because of just what Nancy's wearing on the cover, which we'll discuss in a minute. But like many of these books, they all kind of blur together for me, but there are certain ones that I'm like, I'll just look at the cover and I get a real strong feeling like, okay, I remember really loving this one or really hating it. But I mean, Nancy goes to Scotland, so what's not to love? And actually, fun fact, this book is kind of what Silent Spy, that Nancy Drew game, is based off of. They don't have any similarity in plots whatsoever because we don't talk about Nancy's mom in this book at all, other than casually mentioning that she passed away when Nancy was 3. But it's just the fact that they're set in Scotland. That's literally the only coincidence. So, The Clue of the Whistling Bagpipes is book number 41, and it was first published in 1964. So, we've got one book cover to discuss today, and it's iconic. I feel like this is one of the covers that most people remember. But Nancy is all decked out in her Highland gear. She's got this plaid skirt on, she's got the knee socks on, and a vest, and she's wearing this jaunty little beret on her head that has a little fuzzy on top of it, and she's living her best life up in the hills of Scotland somewhere. It looks like Isle of Skye. It looks really beautiful. There's a lake in the background and some sheep and just pretty trees and mountains. I want to go here. And actually, I have been to Scotland. I actually got to go back in 2022, and I was mostly around Edinburgh and some of the countryside. We really didn't get to see as much of Isle of Skye as I would have liked to have seen. But what I saw of Scotland, it was beautiful, and this is a pretty accurate representation. And also, we haven't even gotten to the coolest part of this cover. Nancy Drew is playing the bagpipes. And of course she has to because she's Nancy Drew and they're in the title of this book. But this is literally my dream. So fun fact, I actually play the oboe. I wouldn't say that I'm very good at it. It's been a while since I've played, but I used to have bragging rights I'm the 7th in the state, but then how many people really play the oboe, But I've always wanted to play the bagpipes, but they just strike me as that kind of instrument that's where do you practice? You've got to go out into the moors and out to the mountains, where you can just let that thing echo off of everything. And I don't know, it seems like with the bagpipes, there's two camps. There's the people that love the bagpipes and the people that hate them. And I just happen to love them. And I don't think there's any other instrument that makes me that emotional. The bagpipes can make me cry. And no, not because they make my ears bleed, but because it's just so beautiful. And it's definitely one of those instruments you need it to echo and it just sounds so cool. So yeah, learning to play the bagpipes is on my bucket list, and it's so fitting that Nancy's doing this because Nancy has so many obscure talents, and this just went on her very long list of things that she can do. So that is the basic description of the cover that we're working with for this episode. And if you ever want to see these book covers, I post them on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays, the day before the episode airs. So I came up with 2 or 3 funny cover spoofs. I love to do these because I just like to look at the book and cover up the title with my hand and just come up with some crazy title based on what I'm seeing. So the first cover spoof that I came up with is Good Girl Gone Plaid, because of course Nancy is rocking this plaid skirt, and I just went with that theme and ran with it. So the second funny cover spoof is Breaking Plaid, like Breaking Bad, and there's no such thing as plaid publicity. Now, the more that I read the book, I thought that last funny cover spoof was very appropriate because, as we see, that's not always true. sometimes there is such thing as bad publicity, and Nancy kind of figures that out the hard way. So I gave this book cover a rating of 5 magnifying glasses. I've always loved this book cover. It just catches your eye, and it makes me want to go to Scotland again. Like, I just want to go. But it's so neat, and Nancy is, of course, like, she never looks bad in anything, you know? So now we're going to go ahead and jump into some of the characters that show up in the clue of the Whistling Bagpipes. So we have Lady Douglas, which I believe is Nancy's great-grandmother on her mother's side. I think it is so neat that we finally got to meet her. And there's also Paul Petrie, who bought Nancy's autograph. Dewar, Fiona Fraser, who kind of serves as their guide while they're in Scotland. Morag, I think that's how you say it, a maid to Lady Douglas, and Tweedy, her butler. I'm sorry, I'm going to let you all in on a little secret. Even though I have some Scottish heritage in my background, I'm going to mispronounce some of these names. I'm so sorry. So without further ado, let's jump into the synopsis. Nancy and Carson set out to go to Scotland to help Nancy's great-grandmother, Lady Douglas, find a lost family heirloom. But before they can leave, Nancy receives threats telling her not to go to Scotland. Bess and George get to tag along because Bess entered a picture of Nancy using her magnifying glass into a photo contest and wins a trip for 2 to anywhere in Europe. This public exposure helps and hinders Nancy throughout the case. Nancy is told by her great-grandmother that a brooch is missing, and Nancy and the girls are run off the road, then followed and harassed by the thieves in a sheep-stealing ring as they get closer to figuring out their schemes. Nancy decodes how they send messages, learns to play the bagpipes, and the thieves are captured, and the brooch is found at the bottom of Lady Douglas's pond. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with to sum this all up is Great Scott, internationally famous teen detective solves sheep thievery and finds family heirloom. So I took down some fun direct quotes and notes for this one, and let's go ahead and discuss. So apparently the first thing that stuck out to me in this book was Ned just got back from South America. It doesn't really say what he was doing there, but he took a trip there. I guess it had something to do with his studies at Emerson. But Ned gets around. He does quite a bit of globetrotting even without Nancy. So Carson actually mentions to Nancy that they're going to go over to Scotland and help Lady Douglas find this missing brooch. And that's kind of the start of this mystery. They're just trying to help her figure out what happened to it. Was it just misplaced? Was it stolen? So it's kind of a mystery, but kind of not. But if you think that a piece of missing jewelry seems pretty tame now, don't worry. Nancy gets up to so many hijinks in this mystery. So the next note that I took down is Hannah makes a comment that she hopes the heirloom is small because the house is so full of trophies from all over the world from Nancy's cases, and Nancy jokes about moving the piano to make room for more. I mean, I personally would love to see all of the things that Nancy has collected, because as much as I rag on her for not taking, like, monetary compensation for her cases, she has a Paul Revere bell from The Mystery of the Tolling Bell. She has all this jewelry that people have given her, weird random artifacts. Like, it probably is pretty chaotic in the Drew household. Okay, so we get another clue as to how Nancy feels about Ned, because Ned is always making these romantic gestures towards Nancy, and she just kind of rebuffs him sometimes in the books, but Nancy describes Ned in this book as the nicest man she knows after her father. That's a pretty glowing compliment. And Ned was obviously thinking about Nancy even when he was in South America, because he gives her this wooden monkey pin, and he says he hopes Nancy can get back before June 10th for a fraternity party that Emerson is throwing. And then Ned just kind of mentions in passing that he heard about these sheep going missing and being stolen in Scotland, and that just kind of struck me as funny. Like, even though he's out jet setting, he picked up on this news. Like, I don't know about you, but I'm aware of, like, crime and things going on in my own country and occasionally in other places when it warrants, like, international coverage. But I don't know, a ring of sheep thieves doesn't really rank high for me, and I just don't picture Lester Holt talking about it, you know? So we're now to the part of this book where publicity comes into the picture. So Bess entered a picture of Nancy in a photo contest, and it was a picture of her examining footprints with a magnifying glass. It's kind of funny because in the next few books, Bess is quite the shutterbug. Like, she carries a camera around, and you can tell that photography is sort of a hobby of hers. but she won this trip for 2 to anywhere she wants to go in Europe. And I was like, that is so cool. And it was so neat that she thought to do that. And she actually invites Nancy. She's like, I want you to be the other person that I invite because you were in the picture and you helped me win. So Nancy tells Bess that she'll be thinking about where they can go, and then they hang up. Now cue a car accident. So Nancy has to hang up partially because there's a loud noise outside, and this car just rams into hers and Ned's car that are parked in front of her house. And I noticed too that Nancy's convertible, it was yellow in the last few books and now it's blue again. So it went from blue to yellow to blue. But the driver that hits their cars, he just leaves and there's no license plate on the car. So they have to figure out who did it. So it's not long after this that Nancy gets this threatening note saying she's going to be in danger in any car she gets into, along with a piece of Douglas tartan. So the Douglas tartan pattern is blue, green, and white, and I believe it's actually in the game, The Silent Spy, but it's kind of getting really scary. Like, Nancy is getting these threats. Her car has been damaged. Like, she's not even left America yet, and she's getting all these bad things that are happening to her. So this next bit I thought was kind of interesting. Nancy, Hannah, and Togo go for a run. I guess Hannah can keep up. She runs that household, so like obviously she's going to run circles around Nancy, probably going down the block. But they all go for this run together, and when they come home, they hear this ticking in the mailbox, and it's a bomb. So Nancy takes it out of the mailbox and hurls it across the yard, and it goes off. It explodes, and she finds fragments of a note and pieces them together, and it says, "Drew is going to bomb you." That is super scary. Like, the fact that somebody made this bomb and put it on the side of Nancy's house in her mailbox, like, ugh. Just the thought of it is terrifying. But this is actually the 4th time that Nancy has had a bomb used against her. I've actually been keeping tally of all the ways that Nancy has had near-death experiences. And actually, I'm going to make this into a bonus episode for the podcast. So if you're curious, I'm going to do it after I've completed The Mystery at Crocodile Island. I wanted to get done with the originals so I could have like a comprehensive list. Just in case you want to know how many boat accidents Nancy's had or how many times she's been hit over the head. So my next note is Nancy goes into town and she sees her picture in Photographic International. And when she turns around, there's this crowd of people on the sidewalk and they just start clapping and cheering for her. And it makes her uncomfortable because Nancy never likes to get credit for anything that she does. It's like one of her character traits. But she does sign some autographs just for some kids because they beg her to. And then she sees this man buying her autograph from one of them. And he says, "Thanks, babe, this will come in handy," and runs away. And of course, Nancy doesn't like to make a big deal out of it. She wants to chase the guy, but there's all these people standing around, so she doesn't. But Nancy is internationally known now. She's getting recognized as a good detective, and people are starting to recognize her on the street, so this is just going to make her job 10 times harder. So Ned brings Nancy a magazine, and in it there's an article about the autograph incident and a picture of Nancy starting to chase after the thief. So not only did she get all this publicity from Bess entering her photo into that photo contest, which was really sweet, but now she's got all this negative publicity about the publicity, so she can't catch a break. But Ned actually asks Nancy if she really wants to go to Scotland because he got a phone call saying if he wants his girlfriend to stay alive, don't let her go to Scotland. So not only were they threatening Nancy, now they're threatening Ned, and he's scared for her safety, but of course Nancy's not going to give up a case. She never does. So Bess and George get to come along to Scotland since Bess won that trip. She just asks George to be her +1, and I thought this was really cool that they did this. I'm wondering if like Carol and Keene, quote unquote, you know, the people at Grosset and Dunlap got fan mail to Nancy like, hey, you know, can you make it a little more relatable how your friends get to go on every trip with you? I just thought it was neat that Bess won a contest and it wasn't just Carson being like, hey, everybody gets to go. You get a trip and you get a trip. But it's really cool because we get a detailed description of what the girls are wearing to the airport, and it says Nancy wore a dark blue and green striped sports dress under her navy coat. Bess wore a 2-piece powder blue suit, and George wore a navy skirt and tailored white blouse. They sound so put together. Like, more power to you girls, but I'm usually wearing sweatpants when I go to the airport. So Nancy, Bess, and George get to go up to New York, and they see Aunt Eloise because they have a connecting flight from there to Scotland. And she teaches Nancy a quick lesson on the chanter, which I guess is the little flute-like part of the bagpipes. It almost looks like a recorder, but Nancy picks it up enough to learn a couple songs, and of course she's good at it. Everything just comes so naturally to her. So the next note that I have down is there's some plane trouble while they're flying over the Atlantic, and plates and cups go flying, and it's back in the 60s, so I'm sure they have like actual cutlery, like forks and knives and spoons and stuff, but everyone's okay. They left it like as a cliffhanger at the end of a chapter, and then everyone was fine, thankfully. I don't know, I love to travel and go places, but I am the person that is definitely like checking the little TV on the back of the seat in front of you to see where the plane is over the ocean. Like, I try not to think about it, and then I end up being like, okay, where are we? How much longer till we get there? So they touch down in Scotland, and when they check into their hotel, Nancy finds a note that says Rathod Dig Glass Slat Long Mall Bean Ball Gun all. Like, I don't know. It was a bunch of gibberish to me. But there's a picture of a bagpipe, boat, and a building. And then Nancy gets a phone call from the lobby saying they got assigned to the wrong room. So they get moved to the right room, go down to the restaurant to eat, and Bess notices this man eavesdropping, who then leaves. So Nancy looks at the ticket on the table, and his name is Dewar. So the first room that they were assigned to was Mr. Dewar's room. They just got assigned it by accident. Dewar, Daru, similar sounding names. But he's really mad that they saw that note and read it. So the girls rent a car and go to Loch Lomond, and they're driving on the left as they're supposed to when someone drives straight for them. This book has a lot of car mishaps and car accidents, but they speculate that maybe it was another American and they were just driving on the wrong side of the road over there, because they're used to driving on the right in this country. But they speed off, and the girls are pretty scared about it, but they collect their wits and continue on. So when Nancy, Bess, and George get to Loch Lomond, they end up helping a mother and daughter whose houseboat flips because there's a big storm that blows in. And there's people there that recognize Nancy from the magazine. So Nancy is like, great, my cover's been blown. So this next note is really cool. Nancy goes to a bagpipe factory, and the man makes a comment that girls don't play them often. And I said, why do I have a feeling Nancy is going to be a total boss and play them anyway? So she gets the bagpipes out, and she's pretty good at it because she's played on that chanter with Aunt Eloise before she came to Scotland. Just call her Nancy One Lesson Drew. She picks it up right off the bat. So Nancy, Bess, and George, of course, want to do some sightseeing while they're in Scotland. So they go to this castle, and Nancy ends up disappearing on the sightseeing tour, and the guide said she might be in the suffocation room. I had never heard of this. I was looking this up, and I went down this whole rabbit hole of like torture devices in weird castles, and I was like, okay. Suffice it to say that a suffocation room is not the place that you want to be, but thankfully that's not where Nancy is, and when they finally catch up to her and find her, she says she saw that guy Pete who bought her autograph in River Heights, so she chased him and he jumped into a car with the guy named Dewar that they saw at the hotel. So Pete has apparently followed Nancy from River Heights, creepy, and he is working with Dewar, so this goes a lot deeper. My next note says that Ned does some detective work back in the States and some handwriting analysis, and he guesses that it was an older woman who wrote the note about the bomb. He doesn't really say why. I don't know if it's because it's in cursive or it's just written a certain way, but he goes to grocery stores, and because I guess that's where he thinks older women hang out, and he stands near the checkout lines talking about bombs to see who gets nervous. I'm sorry, but I think most people would be a little bit nervous if you started talking about bombs in public, and I don't know if this is really detective work or a red flag and a quick, way to end up on the terrorist watch list with Homeland Security, but it apparently works for Ned because he finds Miss Morrison, who overheard the bomb plot against Nancy, and she's the one that wrote the note. She wanted to warn her. So good job, Ned. You didn't football tackle somebody, but you used your deductive reasoning and skills to figure out part of the mystery. So Nancy, Bess, and George next go to Edinburgh Castle, and this was cool to read about this because I've actually been there, and it's such a neat place. But it says the guards smile at them, and I just wrote, no, they don't. They were super serious. They were a lot like the guards at Buckingham Palace when we went. I don't know. Maybe they just smiled at Nancy, Bess, and George because they were pretty. But anyway, their tour guide tells them how kilts were illegal around the time of the Jacobite Rebellion. And Bess says, I'm glad that kilts were revived. Men look so picturesque wearing them. Like, Bess can always be counted on to make some humor and lighten up the situation. So my next note says, Nancy, Bess, and George are followed by a red-bearded man on the Royal Mile near Holyrood Palace. And again, I just think it's so cool when they mention actual places in the Nancy Drew books. So when we were over in Scotland and we were staying in Edinburgh, we actually stayed right there on the Royal Mile, right up from the palace, and it was really, really neat. So my next note is the girls meet Fiona Fraser, and she translates the Gaelic note from the hotel room. Okay, I was pretty sure it was Gaelic, but I didn't want to misspeak. I completely butchered that. I can't speak it. But it apparently translates to highway ditch, lock rod, ship, slow wife, member without stamp. Like, it doesn't make any more sense in English. So the red-bearded man that was following Nancy, Bess, and George comes back, and he rams Nancy's car into the water after they get off the ferry. That was really intense, but there's this kind woman named Miss Drummond, and she says they can stay with her until their car gets fixed. So that night, Nancy hears a bagpipe out on the moor and a sheep in a passing truck. And so she starts to speculate, like, I wonder if this is the sheep thieves that Ned was talking about. Now, the next thing that I wrote down has to do with the missing heirloom that Lady Douglas is trying to find, because we've kind of sidetracked that for all these other aspects of the mystery. But it was a large topaz brooch with diamonds. Yeah, that sounds pretty valuable. We probably want to find that. So I thought this next part of the book was kind of cool because we get a description of different tartans and kind of learn a little bit about Scottish heritage. But the girls dress in different tartans, and it says Fiona wears ogilvy, I think is how you say it, in red and blue checks with white lines. George wears a yellow and black plaid for MacLeod's of Lewis. Bess wears Stuart, large white squares with red and green stripes, and Nancy wears Cameron, which is red squares with dark green stripes. I just think it's so neat to hear about the different patterns of the tartans, because while we were over there, we stopped in several shops and they have scarves and skirts, and you can get these tartans on pretty much anything. But it's neat to look through the books. There's so many names and so many different patterns. So Nancy, Bess, George, and Fiona go camping and hiking into the Highlands, and they hear the bagpipes again. So they hike up this mountain to kind of get a better look and see if they can see where the person is that's playing. And George gets pushed down the hill by the red-haired bearded man. That guy is everywhere. But once they get to George and see that she's okay, they found a croft or a hut with a dictionary open to the word mall. Nancy also finds her signature on a piece of paper under it. So it's not long after this that the police come to see her, and they say that she's accused of writing bad checks. So you remember good old Pete, who took her autograph while they were in River Heights? He's taken her autograph, and he's basically learned to forge her signature. So now he's written all these bad checks in Nancy's name. I don't know, villains are bad just by themselves, but it's even worse when they start using your signature and forging that, or trying to steal your identity. Like, that makes it 10 times worse because they attack your character. So my next note just says the girls have to put out a brush fire in the Highlands, and they actually grab these brooms that are they just happen to be in these huts nearby. But thankfully the fire didn't spread too bad. But Fiona tells them the brooms are there for that purpose, just in case of fire. And usually the Highlands are pretty wet and it's rainy there, but sometimes it's like if it's dry enough, they can go up like tinder. So the next thing that I wrote down is the girls are chasing the red-bearded man in their rental car, but then they run out of gas. So they have to make a call for petrol, and they have to stop at a house and use someone's telephone. But I was like, That stinks because they left off right at the end of a chapter, like Nancy's car sputtered and they slowly rolled to a stop. Lesson number 1, when chasing the bad guys, always make sure that your tank is full of gas. But it ends up being okay because the guy is apprehended by the police, and they say his name is Sandy Duff, but he's wearing a disguise, and it ends up being Paul Petrie, otherwise known as Pete. And he says that Tweety has the heirloom. So he accuses Lady Douglas's butler of stealing the brooch. It was the butler with the brooch in the fancy estate in Scotland. So Nancy follows up on this lead, and Tweety says that he doesn't have the brooch, and Nancy believes him because he seems like a pretty straightforward and honest guy. So Tweety actually also helps Nancy make a reed to play Scots Whay on the bagpipes because she thinks that it's a signal that the sheep stealing gang has been using to notify, people when to move the sheep and when to stay put because the authorities are nearby. So she's going to use that to signal and get them to come out of hiding. So there's also this whole subplot where the girls found this strange painting under these ashes in the hut where Nancy's signature was found. So Nancy gets a goblet from Lady Douglas and she paints it with quicksilver and uses it kind of as a mirror. So it reveals a broch, which I hope I'm saying that right, but it's a stone building. And when they go searching some of these, they find an entire sheep graveyard. So the thieves have been stealing these sheep and then shearing their wool and then just depositing them in this graveyard and burying them. I think Nancy comes to the conclusion that it's easier to do this to just take their wool and then not try to resell the sheep or sell their meat or anything because they probably have identifying markers on their ears and they would be easier to trace back to where they were stolen from. It doesn't make it any less sad though. So my next note is Nancy is out there with the bagpipes and she's out kind of staking out in the hills in the Highlands, and she finds the sheep and then she almost gets attacked by a wildcat. And she manages to scare it off by throwing a rock at it. I mean, how scary is that, though? It's like those videos you see. I've seen a few where people will be hiking out in the middle of nowhere and then mountain lions just kind of show up. And it's, that's why I don't hike, guys. I will not do it. So Nancy plays the bagpipes and she and the officers see men spraying the sheep to knock them out. Like they were knocking them out with some kind of gas because they're quieter when they're transporting them. Which is pretty cruel, actually, but it seems like a lot of work. But anyway, Dewar and Paul Petrie are caught, and it was Paul's wife that was impersonating Nancy and signing bad checks, because obviously she looked more like a Nancy than he did. And so he also says the brooch is at the bottom of Lady Douglas's pond. So apparently he had been casing Lady Douglas's house, and he had seen her wearing the brooch, and she had dropped it. And he had went to get it, and the dog had gone after him, and he dropped it in the pond. But it says he also sprayed her dog and killed it. So not only was he being cruel to these sheep, but then he killed Lady Douglas's dog, which is really messed up. So my last note just says Nancy dives in the pond and finds the brooch. So we get a happy ending to the end of the story. The heirloom is located, and the sheep thieves are put in jail. So for the next part of this podcast, I like to do a thing called What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen, and Hannah actually made a few things before Nancy went across the pond to Scotland, and she made lemon meringue pie and strawberries, bacon, eggs, and muffins. And then we got a couple of descriptions of some things that Nancy ate while she was in Scotland, and there was cockadeki soup, which is leeks and hen, mutton stew with potatoes and turnips, kale, bread pudding, and treacle dotty, which is apparently like little bitty candies. So for the add that to your resume section of this podcast, I came up with several things that I think Nancy could add to her resume. I said she's a note repairer, so when that bomb goes off and the note gets blasted to many pieces, she's able to put it back together. We see this a lot in the Nancy Drew games too. Sometimes we have to piece together letters. But Nancy's also a mirror marvel. She takes that goblet and paints it with quicksilver, and I'd never heard of doing that. That's really cool. And I said that Nancy could also be a Highland hiker. They went through the Highlands a lot over to Loch Lomond, and they did a lot of hiking and camping. And bagpipe player. So that's just one of the other things we can add to Nancy's list of skills. So now we'll talk about the things I liked and the things I didn't like about the clue of the Whistling Bagpipes. So I thought Nancy being in Scotland was really cool. The scenery was really neat for this book. And I also liked that Nancy got to go over there and spend some time with her great-grandmother because, I don't know, like most of my relatives are stateside, but that would be so cool to go visit a relative in another country. And then for the things that I didn't like, I really couldn't think of anything other than maybe like the way that they sprayed the sheep and they were cruel to animals in this book. That wasn't my favorite. So I gave the clue of the Whistling Bagpipes an overall rating of 4 magnifying glasses. It was a really good book. It was enjoyable, it was funny in parts, and I just love that we got to go to Scotland. So this one is probably in my top 10 of the original Yellow Spines anyway. I'll have to do a definitive list of like my top 5 or my top 10 books at some point. So that concludes today's episode, and for next week's episode we're going to be talking about The Phantom of Pine Hill. So if you like, or well, I shouldn't say like, but if you want to read about Native American burial grounds being desecrated and weird fraternity rituals, then you won't want to miss this one. It's an interesting one. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.